controversial is not because it represents a step of progress of dirty power to clean power. It's controversial because that is all Class 1 agricultural land. That means that it is very, very productive. You have all of this fertile soil down on the river valley. This is the Peace River you see. And you actually have one of the most northerly latitudes where you can get a crop of sweet corn off. Your last kind of frost date there, is mostly going to be June 30th, but sometimes July 15th, right? You might be getting frost early in September. So how do you get a crop off? Well, because you've got 20 to 23 hours of sunlight, right? So it's a remarkable spot. It's a remarkable microclimate, which you can grow a lot of food in. But it's also this spot where you've got land use contestation, and I think you have basically a reinforcement. Of this narrative of land being either or. You can either use it for Indian totem poles, or you can use it for oil derricks. You can either use it for dirty energy, or you can use it for clean energy. You can either use it for energy, or you can use it for farming, but you can't have both, right? British Columbia, when I was living there, was really driven by the primary economic sector, that basically being turning natural resources into economic goods. So it's your fishing, it's your farming, it's your forestry, it's your mining, it's your oil and gas. And you can see this on the crest of the largest city in the province. This is Vancouver's official crest. By sea, land, and air, we prosper. And the two kind of shield bearers, you have, a very nice Teutonic couple, a logger and a fisherman. And again, this was kind of the story of where wealth emerged from in British Columbia at that time. The story has changed a little bit. So you've got wealth and value based on a hinterland, based on basically a big, huge chunk of land that you can extract natural resources from. And you also have this idea that in order to progress, you can choose one or the other, but you can't have it all. I'm about to get into how I went from there to Yale, but as a brief detour, in British Columbian context, Yale means something very different than in US context. This is Yale in BC. It was once a little mining town on the Fraser River, long since basically depopulated. The old New Get Motel was the Gold Nugget Motel. And when I told someone in my family, my dad's side of the family were all loggers, basically. And when I said, I got a new job, I'm going to Yale, I got this sympathetic look, which was, well, something better will come up. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the University of British Columbia. These are a few background slides as to what's happening at the Center for Sustainable Food Systems, and these slides were actually grabbed from a presentation that I gave to the university's Board of Governors. And it was leading the pathway to approve a formal academic plan for the Center for Sustainable Food Systems, something that the Board of Governors and the Senate would be able to get behind and say, yeah, this is part of the center of the university's mission. And part of making that case was making the case that the UBC Farm and the academic center that housed it were basically, you were backing the right horse. This was a winning team. Showing evidence that this was going on an upwards trajectory was important there, and it will be important here too. So the idea that we were starting from a solid foundation, the idea that we had the land base in place, that we had, if we knew there was going to be programmatic security, that we basically had the natural resources, the human resources, the expertise, the talent to make this thing grow really, really well. And in part, this was because there was a much more modest plan that was released earlier. And the nice thing about releasing modest goals is that you can achieve and exceed them. And so this is a great way to launch into a next phase. Showing growth trajectories on everything that you measure. By the time that I left, we had over 3,000 students who were engaged at the UBC Farm physically every year. This is remarkable because it actually took a little ways to get to the farm from the center of campus. This was not something you could do in between classes. And this, by the way, is people involved in credit courses. This doesn't include extracurricular. This is actually just a number of courses. There was about 60 courses on the calendar that were using the UBC Farm specifically for teaching when I left. The idea that this was bringing in more operating revenue to keep things going. So this was basically just showing growth in what we were selling as fee-for-service, what we were selling in farm gate sales, and then, ever important, what was coming in terms of affiliated research grants. So what were faculty bringing in for grants to do work at the farm? So being able to show sort of growth in all of these areas was very important. You know, you wouldn't be able to claim that level of growth if you weren't able to sell I think a strong narrative of partnership, which was something that we did in everything. Because, you know, there weren't enough of us basically to host 60 courses and bring in $5 million in research revenue. The only way we would be able to do that would be to build a web of partnerships across campus and make sure that other people had the autonomy and the agency to kind of sink their teeth into a project they were really excited by. And this was not just at UBC, this was off campus as well. I made this slide to give a sense of the scale and the breadth of what was going on at the UBC Farm. The idea is you're not supposed to, and then the projects which they undertook, that you're getting into something which was large enough that it kind of had a life of its own. And in doing this, it was just giving the idea that this was really a hub of activity that would sort of self-sustain just because of the sheer level of interest. And as far as I know, that has only continued to expand since I left UBC. But at the heart of this was a rejection of the narrative that I grew up with, which was that you can either use land for this or you can use it for that. Instead, we adopted this motto, no one thing does just one thing. And also, when you only have 60 acres to work with and you're dealing with over 150 projects, that isn't really an option to give every single project their own little fiefdom, right? And so, trying to embody this motto of making sure that everything and every relationship and every process in turn linked to many things, many relationships, and many processes, that kind of drove the philosophy of how we would choose projects and how we would connect projects to others. The example that I gave in many of these presentations was about the honeybee hives. People would come to the farm, they would see the honeybee hives, they would be excited because bees, honey. But then I could kind of tell them about their agronomic importance, and many people didn't sort of reflect on the idea that not only do we thank a honeybee for every third bite of food that we take, it's also the interesting bites of foods that we take that we can thank honeybees for. And without them, our diet would be a kind of bland succession of wheat potatoes, wheat potatoes, wheat potatoes, wheat potatoes. And life would be far less enjoyable. They had probably heard about colony collapse disorder and about the overwinter die-offs and the concern there. And so being able to tell them, well, actually, this is an area of very active research here at UBC. We have collaborators in the Center for High Throughput Biology. They are using very, very fancy mass spectrometers. They are using them to do statistical analysis on the DNA of successive generations of honeybees in a rapid breeding program so that they can tell in a matter of weeks, rather than in a matter of an entire honeybee generation, whether this new generation has the resistance to, say, foul brood or to the varroa mite, things which would be implicated in colony collapse disorder. So basically breeding a healthier honeybee by using this sort of cutting-edge technology and high-throughput biology. It tells this good story where we're linking something that looks very folksy with something which is very cutting-edge and is addressing a very pressing global need. But it doesn't stop there. They weren't just the objects of research for the biologists, right? They were also objects of research indirectly for our students in agronomy. So they went off to pollinate all of those butternut squash, all of those winter squash that you see. And those were being used in different field trials. They were using them in biofertilizer trials. They were using them in biochar trials. They were using them in biodegradable mulching trials, trying to figure out basically, does this work better than that? Coming out with some very good results that were actually very useful. And they helped growers in the region be able to kind of either pursue one direction or steer clear of another, because they were in direct response to questions that we had received from farmers. Once we got the research from the fields, we harvested all of those squash and then turned them over to both our nutrition students as well as our business students. The nutrition students created a wonderful recipe for butternut squash pizza, which was delicious and nutritious. They worked with one of the food service outlets that had kind of the autonomy to bring new things on the menu and take new suppliers on. And then with our business students, they just marketed these things up using every manipulative psychological trick in the book so that when you went to that outlet, you could not help yourself except to buy that butternut squash pizza. They were also able to figure out a fairly stable financial arrangement so that we knew well in advance that we would be able to sell $15,000 of butternut squash to that particular food service outlet, and we knew that they would sell, and they knew that they would sell because they had the best and the brightest students working on the problem, and so we knew that it would work. So by bringing these things together, it's an emphasis on how when you start to get into farm-based learning, you can reject that idea that it's a kind of either-or zero-sum game, and rather you can advance the idea that we can continue to grow, we can continue to add new things and new dimensions without kind of breaking some fundamental ecological limit. We would do a lot of teaching and learning at all ages. It wasn't just the credit courses, but when we brought in kind of extracurricular activity, we tried to give it some curricular linkage. So for example, of course the school kids want to come to the farm, and of course you're not going to say no, right? And of course you're not going to lose the opportunity to take these kind of pictures to share with people who cherish the university. But we linked them to the Faculty of Education so that the students, the children, became subjects of research as well. And there's a whole interesting literature, some of it a little bit speculative, basically on biophilia and about experiential learning and how you are able to pick up things, retain things, internalize things in an active physical setting like this, as opposed to when you're sort of doing it inside a classroom. And how does that change if you're in an outdoor space versus an indoor space? How does it change if you're looking at kind of repeating particular things? How do you reinforce all of this kind of stuff? And actually having teachers, having students in the Faculty of Education who could follow this over years and actually figure out not just at the end of the semester, but when these kids graduate, how did it affect them? You know, that's work that we haven't really done seriously yet, you know? And this could be incredible stuff that could happen here. It could happen at any university. At the time that I was sort of showing these slides, we were aspiring to get a more formal faculty association. So basically those faculty members who were bringing their courses to the farm, we wanted to be able to provide them some kind of incentive, right? Either just straight up cash, maybe teaching relief, maybe affiliation, maybe a sort of wonderful collegial community that you would otherwise not gain access to. And so we proposed and then later launched this idea of having like this strong faculty associate cohort. As fellows, I think we did manage to figure out some kind of teaching relief for them so that they could focus a little bit more on a very intentional curricular development piece so that it wasn't just going down to the farm and picking up some things by osmosis, if you're lucky. It was actually going down with a lot of intentional design behind what it is that they're seeing, how you're interpreting it, how you're working that into a physical activity, and what you expect to come out of it at the end. And then finally, research. Every university is going to have its ebbs and flows as a pendulum is going to sort of swing back and forth between research and service and teaching. And that is going to change over time. Some will end up occasionally sort of like with a hard swing where it's all about research. UBC was kind of on a research path when we were selling the idea of the farm. And so bringing in what research was linked to the most pressing, most globally relevant kind of things the administration was concerned with, that was essential. And one of the nice things, a silver lining perhaps, was that the linkages between agri-food systems and climate change were really just coming into the fore of academic and public interest sort of in the mid-2000s. And we had some excellent biometeorologists working at UBC. And so we were able to link them into work at the farm and begin to collect data. In some cases, it was just instrument calibration. And in other cases, it was collecting new data to help understand this interesting kind of web between different feedbacks in agri-food systems and where those were kind of hot spots when it came to greenhouse gas emissions. But it wasn't just about the natural sciences. Thankfully, at UBC, we still had enough kind of an elevation and seriousness taken for the social sciences that we were able to link in social sciences faculty as well. And as you might have guessed from that first slide of British Columbia, the question of sort of like the history of settler colonial relations / genocide, and where the current status of the First Nations peoples in British Columbia stand, what is the appropriate way, I guess, to recognize what happened? How can we agree on truth? How can we seek some kind of reconciliation? Where can we move forward? These were central to a lot of the social sciences research mandate. And the nice thing about the farm space was that the farm space was not coded socially like the rest of the university. When you go to a campus like this, right, the whole layout, the buildings, the roads, the parking lots, the pomp, the circumstance, it all sends a message about who is welcome and who is not. It sends a message about what kind of configurations of people are valuable and what kind of configurations are not. The farm did not have that same coding, in part because we were very intentionally trying to kind of mix the intensively cultivated areas with successional areas, with forest, and trying to not have this control, this sort of disciplined landscape exerted. And in the absence of that disciplined landscape, you kind of removed some of the social coding that basically said, this place is for some but not for others. And it kind of had this effect where you could come there, bring along your own history, and not make assumptions that your history was unwelcome. And in that, we were able to start a whole bunch of really interesting sort of community health-focused initiatives with a number of the First Nations communities nearby, both living on reserve, as well as living off reserve, where you actually had the health metrics looked far worse for those people who were living off reserve than those on reserve. And it was actually in those populations where we sort of did, I think, some very intentional work with how do we elevate, I think, the traditional indigenous knowledge to the point where it can be considered as, I guess, admissible evidence in the fight against diabetes or something like that, right? How do you change the view as to like what is allowed in and what's not allowed in as far as knowledge about health? I left with this big idea that maybe the UBC Farm would be the place where we would fully make the invisible visible. That we would figure out with our natural scientists, for example, ways to determine every single flux of every greenhouse gas and every chunk of carbon in its different forms and every piece of nitrogen going here, there, and everywhere. And that maybe for all of these things beyond our sensory realm, we would be able to measure it all. With our social scientists, we would be able to figure out kind of which of these things are contributing to a just society and which of these things are contributing to further alienation. And perhaps we would get to this point where all of those invisible things would come into our realm of visibility and legibility. The administration, especially because it was very into STEM research, loved the idea. Since I have gone to Yale, This is no longer an idea that I would attempt to pitch or support. Connecting it, though, to some sort of global imperative, which in this case happened to be climate change, was essential, I think, in making the case as to the value of all these things that we were doing. The idea that there could be a target as well was very appealing, and it linked into the university's sustainability plan. As I have mentioned, my thinking on this has changed, and I'm no longer a great supporter of targets, even if I will give my sort of hesitant support to the idea of measuring a lot more. I am generally critical today of the idea of assigning targets. We might not get into that. So behind all of this was UBC's own either-or land use conflict. Vancouver is the third least affordable city in the world. In other words, it has the third highest housing values in the world. The real estate development arm of the university put some speculative valuation around $10 million an acre, hence $600 million, north of $500 million, as to what might be yielded to the endowment should the farm be turned into market housing, if we were to put condos there. So this, again, was sort of an either-or framing. We were able to turn that either-or framing on its head, in part because we had very smart planners and architects that we were working with. In part because I think we were able to build bridges with the real estate development arm of the university rather than just going up as a complete confrontation. The strategy that we used to actually protect that land despite its value was a basic density transfer. It's not that sophisticated, but it hadn't occurred to the university before. Basically, if you build up instead of building out, then you can get your people in. The real estate developer actually makes more money because as you go up those higher floors, I think it's past floor 15 where the real estate developer really starts to rake in the cash, right? So if you do that, your people can live up top, your farms can remain kind of on an incident plane to the sun, which is important for photosynthesis. So basically by selling the idea that density was a good pro-farmland, pro-conservation solution, we were able to have our cake and eat it too, so to speak. The real estate development arm was able to get their cash. The university was able to get more housing units on campus. They were able to cut the commutes coming in from off campus. We were able to keep the farm. We had to rip open almost every piece of legislation. It involved an amendment at the BC legislature to the BC Universities Act. We got this green academic land use designation and an awful lot of autonomy over how that would be used, but basically the agreement was no market housing. When I left, we were able to get approval for a joint directorship. So instead of just having me trying to do all the stuff, we got an academic director and an operations director, and that model has proven incredibly effective. We were able to get our faculty affiliate program working. So the faculty community surrounding that farm right now is very strong, very vibrant, and they have appropriate incentives to be working on that. And it enjoys broad support from the university. In the university's sort of centennial marketing and all this kind of stuff and their development push that came afterwards, you know, the farm and the development of the center was the thing that they were pushing. And far from being something that they wished would go away 10 years earlier, it was sort of central to the president's office, the provost's office, as saying this is something that we can turn into the thing that everyone will be looking at UBC because of, right? So a complete turnaround. And that complete turnaround started with all the things that you are doing very well here now at Penn State. Culture shock whiplash. Vancouver, BC to New Haven, Connecticut. University started a little bit earlier than UBC. It had a lot of Oxford-Cambridge envy and sort of created like a simulacrum of Oxford-Cambridge in the 1930s when labor was cheap. And so it's really very, very lovely. It's very, very Hogwarts. It's very Harry Potter. It's a terrific place to be. This is one of the dining halls. This is the old one, Commons. And I had picked up some of these stories that were spread around back in the mid-2000s that there was something going on at one of these dining halls. It was, in fact, a dining hall that was so good that students were forging IDs to get inside. This was the work of an early version of the Sustainable Food Program. This was the Sustainable Food Project, and I had looked at it from Vancouver with a mixture of envy and disdain, I suppose. Envy as to, wouldn't it be nice to work at a university where they actually supported this stuff and where they understood it and they got it? And disdain for exactly the same reason. The problem with starting in the operations side and this dining hall side was that it was too successful. The university embraced it early on. They brought sustainability principles kind of into every meal that was served across campus. And it means that early mission kind of became obsolete, which in a way should just be the ultimate goal of any sustainability-focused organization, is to have success which makes them obsolete. Because then you know that you're not in it for the empire building, hopefully. But it meant that we had to ask different questions, and those different questions have been not about how we serve students food, but how we serve students knowledge. And they've been about how teaching is performed at Yale, how learning is performed at Yale. And that's what our focus has been. We have kind of moved away from the co-curricular and the extracurricular and have moved solely into the domain of the full-on curricular. Where can we link everything to credit courses? We have moved the program from the operations arm of the university into actually Yale College, into the dean's office, which is sort of central to that mission and central to the kind of like liberal arts philosophy. So we're enacting that now on the farm, in the classroom, and pillar number 3, around the world. It didn't import the typefaces. This is a tongue-in-cheek photo, by the way. We apparently have some cultural significance about kale going on, and it makes a good t-shirt. So on the farm, you know, students get to do the farm stuff, but more importantly to me is that they get to inhabit a space that they can never know entirely and they can never control entirely. It gives them a chance to kind of apply chaos and complexity and humility, while at the same time, and you'll notice this is not a zero-sum game, gaining tremendous self-efficacy. They get to do things, they get to create things, they get to see things happen, they get to see the positive influence that they can have on a space that they inhabit. We're bridging farm and classroom together. Some of the best teaching which is happening right now is actually happening right there on the farm. And much of that teaching is student-led. These slides are part of our Need to Know series. Need is spelt with a K, so it's a pun and it's hilarious. It has something to do with bread. It's actually student-driven workshopping of ideas that in many cases are going to end up being their senior theses. So in this case, this is actually Michael, who was a chemistry major. He was a chemistry major who became very, very interested in malting, became very interested in the chemical processes of malting. And here he is actually discussing some fairly obscure chemistry which is going on in that process of sort of like sprouting and stopping the sprouting and the caramelizing that happens with the roasting and all this kind of stuff. And the end of it is basically the globally important problem of how we make better beer. But in the interim, he is getting all of these chemistry skills to a very high level and has had like the full support of his supervisor. We also do traditional classroom learning. Some of that is in traditional classroom style. Others are in hosting these sort of like one-off symposia, conferences, convenings. But you also saw around the world is a big part of what we're doing at the Sustainable Food Program. We've got an acre on campus, and in the context of New Haven and Yale, there are limits to how much you can understand about the world. And it's absolutely vital that we get our students outside of Yale's gates. Because if you stay inside this, right, it's possible to entrench a really warped view of how the world works. So we want to get them out of that. And we want to get them basically boots on the ground at places in the world where interesting things are happening in food. Maybe there's interesting problems that seem intractable, right? Maybe there's some interesting thing which is just kind of ramping up. We want them to be there with open eyes, open ears, and a willingness to help when asked. The idea is that we're growing food literate leaders, and this is something very different than growing farmers or training agricultural scientists or even training sort of like food policy people, public administration and so forth. Food literate leadership is a very, very open category. I'll give you 3 examples and we're stopping. This is Kurt Ellis and Ian Cheney. After graduating from Yale, they worked on this documentary film called King Corn. This is a publicity still from that documentary, King Corn. Kind of like the journalistic work that Michael Pollan has done, it's taken a fairly opaque economic sector and brought it into a narrative that especially urban people are able to kind of negotiate with a little bit. Stuff they hadn't thought of before in a way that they actually want to learn about it, rather than seeming like it's a dry topic that has no interest to them. After making King Corn, and Ian is still making documentaries, he made one recently called The Search for General Tso, which is about where General Tso's chicken came from. I would highly recommend it. But Kurt went on to found Food Corps, based on AmeriCorps, and right now has, I believe, over 5,000 recent graduates working across the country, and they are working specifically on these food and agriculture initiatives on the AmeriCorps model. In the center there in the green is Ariane. After graduating from Yale, she went to work for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition and worked kind of on the merger of some of those sustainable agricultural lobbying interests and really helped to bring those provisions in the last Farm Bill that were very, very helpful for encouraging more sustainable practices of agriculture. She has actually since left the policy world and has gone on to take over a 800-acre farm in Italy and transition this commodity farm into entirely organic. And then finally, that fellow, Josh Evans, who happens to be another Canadian, he graduated shortly after I showed up. We had all of these discussions about how we needed to broaden our thinking about what food was if we wanted to get to a sustainable pattern of provisioning and consuming food. And had all sorts of great conversations about insects, about how insects were just great on paper. Their feed conversion efficiencies, off the charts, better than the other animals we eat. We wrote a grant together, and he went off to Copenhagen to work with the Nordic Food Lab and launched this program that explored the deliciousness of edible insects, which turned into like a 3-year global ethnography. He was going around talking to people who sit among the 2 billion who enjoy and cherish insects as part of their diet, and trying to figure out what is it that makes these things desirable to you and disgusting to a conventional Western palate. And then with the Nordic Food Lab and its associations with Noma and its associations as being the best restaurant in the world, can we use the kind of creative artistry coming out of Noma to reinterpret these things that make insects desirable for so many people in the world to the Western palate, basically? It launched an excellent book, which you can buy. It launched a really good documentary film called Bugs that just premiered in Tribeca. But for Josh, this was also a change of thinking. We realized that if insects were basically turned into a targeted metric to chase, then the incentive would be to turn these creatures that had all sorts of cultural value and flatten them down into a value-free commodity. And what would that mean? Would we still have all of those environmental incentives if we scaled them up? Our finding was no, we would lose them. And that's kind of where I'm leaving it, because Josh is now doing his PhD at Oxford in the Department of Geography. And he is working with some of these ideas of multi-species assemblage. The idea that An insect, if removed from its context and just turned into a commodity that looks great on a spreadsheet, loses all sorts of value that is only retained when it's in place as a network. There's all these things the insect is doing which are not zero-sum, and importantly, are qualitatively incommensurable with one another. And so how do you hang on to all of those multiple values where no one thing is doing just one thing? And a lot of our students are trying to grapple with that. And ideally, if they're moving into positions of food literate leadership, they can shift our thinking. And that fundamentally is what we're trying to do. So, is it stop time or question time?
Round of applause. We have time for some questions. Does anyone have anything to ask?
That was just great, Mark. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the overview. Towards the end, you were starting to get into kind of the international spaces beyond the Yale Farm, and is there a curricular dimension to that, or do you have even anecdotally information about sort of how that works for the students themselves? I mean, I think the experiences and the ideas are like incredibly brilliant and compelling, and I'm just kind of wondering how it translates to students' experiences of their majors and how it works curriculum-wise. Thanks again.
The international experiences that we can support financially run through our Global Food Fellowship. Application to that is competitive, and one of the major criteria as to whether we're able to fund it or not is the strength of its curricular link. So if there's already approval from a faculty advisor, for example, that says this is actually going to provide a research base that's going to end up in a senior thesis, or it's going to end up in this sort of like term paper for this particular course, then I think we'll be very eager to fund it. If the student doesn't have those stronger linkages to something which is actually contributing towards their degree in that way, then we're less likely to fund it. So with that, and the fact that we've got more demand for these things than we can possibly supply, it means that every one of these things is going to have some fairly strong curricular linkage. But to date, we haven't had a whole course take it on. So it's always been like sort of an individual student working on an individual thesis or project or independent study, for example. But we haven't had an entire course integrate an international component like this.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Right there, I had a...
Thanks very much. It was a great talk. And I'm curious, so you expressed at a few different times this kind of skepticism about the value of quantitative measurement or setting targets or this kind of thing. And as a natural scientist, I spend a lot of time measuring things. And I guess but I understand the tension as well, that some things can't be measured and that there's a danger of losing important things when you kind of zero in on metrics that can sometimes be too narrow. But so I guess I'm just curious if you could speak to that a little bit more, like, how do you think about understanding whether you're moving in the right direction on these, there are some very concrete goals, right? Like reducing global warming gases or something like this, that we're either doing that or we're not, from my perspective. And so, like, how do you, I guess I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about your thinking along those lines.
Okay, the question of metrics is a long answer, and I'm going to offer two short responses. One is that measurement has a cost, and that's not just the time that you probably know very, very well as a researcher, the time actually spent collecting the measurement. It's also the opportunity cost of what you could otherwise be doing. But then there is, below sort of the direct cost and the opportunity cost, there's the question as to how does this structure our thinking on how we build value, especially build value into these complex natural systems. I don't say that measurement is not bad. We need measurement. And my call for qualitative richness is exactly that. It is enriching, basically, what is a baseline, and saying that basically the value of that baseline becomes much more valuable when it is enriched with some kind of qualitative assessment of what this thing is actually doing, what process is actually engaged in. The target thing, there's this kind of, it wouldn't be an axiom, maybe it's just kind of a snark comment, and I forget who it is actually associated with, but it's, the saying is basically, once a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a useful metric. What this is saying is that if you turn a metric into a target, say in the practical case of a farmer who is told that they should be reducing their greenhouse gas emissions by this much, then their incentive ceases to be on producing food or whatever their previous incentive was, and it starts to be producing metrics. Because that's what you're asking for. You're not asking for better farming, you're asking for better metrics. And if you have an incentive just to produce a better metric, if that is what you're going to be graded on or subsidized on at the end of the day, people are smart. They will find out every way to subvert the difficult thing to do and attain that metric. And so once you start to put that as something which is your motivator, you'll figure out a way around the practice which that is meant to be motivating. So that's kind of dismal, but there you have it. My goal here is enrichment, and to greenhouse gases, we're either doing it or we're not. Except in the case of agri-food, I don't believe that. In the case of burning fossil fuels, in the case of digging up fossil fuels and burning it, yeah, I would give you that we are probably either emitting greenhouse gases or we're not. Agriculture and food, because they're entangled with, AFOLU, other land uses, because they're entangled with other kinds of land use change, you have all sorts of comings and goings of different gases that are doing different things. And you don't have that kind of robust predictability that says if you reduce your tillage by this much, you are going to reduce global radiative forcing by this much, right? And so often I am encouraging people in the kind of food and agricultural sphere to leave the certainty and the kind of like targeted campaigning to oil and gas and fossil fuels, because there's little that you can do wrong. There's a clear direction to move in. And in the case of agriculture and food, my encouragement is let's talk about enrichment of all of the things that this is doing right now, because in many cases, I think you end up with something better than if you narrow it down to saying, how can we get agriculture and food just to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the board?
We have time for one more question.
Oh, we do. Right up front.
Here, wait for the mic.
In the beginning of the talk, you mentioned how these school food systems projects take place differently at different contexts, and you both work in urban contexts. Both of your examples come in urban contexts, and I was just wondering if you have any thoughts for a land grant, big state school context, and how you could some lessons that you can share.
So, yeah, both Yale and the University of British Columbia are urban campuses, and this is not in the same way. The University of British Columbia still had an agricultural faculty, and we don't have the land grant system in Canada in the same way that you have it here, and that is more of a historical accident than anything. But we still have our 7 big ag schools, or our 7 baccalaureate and beyond degree granting ag schools, and UBC was one of them. There was still kind of a built-in mandate as a public university to do a lot of the things at UBC that Penn State is tasked with its land grant status. So in terms of mission, there were still these rural linkages, and we still had to be cognizant, I think, of what was going on, up north and in the Okanagan Valley and the big agricultural regions of British Columbia. But in both cases, whether it's like fully urban without an ag school, or whether it's kind of in this sort of like halfway fully urban but with a large rural mandate at UBC, in both cases, my encouragement of urban agriculture, which you could do here as well, was to try and direct gaze outwards, right? Was to try and get people to think about what kind of stewardship was required of a rural hinterland in order for an urban center, which I would include this little cluster as. What was required for those urban centers to exist? What debt do cities owe their farms, right? And to avoid directing people's gaze inwards and getting all weirded out about ideas of self-reliance, right? Because I think that actually self-reliance can be a very dangerous idea. If you characterize climate change as a problem not just of global average warming, but as increase in extreme weather events, then I think self-reliance can become a very, very dangerous idea, right? And so in that case, urban agriculture to me is a way to sort of like direct gaze outwards. And the advantage that you've got is that you're already halfway there, right? There's probably less enthusiasm for the idea that the best thing we could be doing at Penn State is growing all of our food on campus, right? And that to me is a good thing.
Cool. Well, that's all the time we have.
Good timekeeping.
Round of applause. Thank you again for making the trek all the way out here. Really appreciate having you on campus. Just as a reminder to everybody, our next showcase won't be until December 8th. We're bringing in Heidi Kunka, who's the director of the Central Pennsylvania U.S. Green Building Council. She'll be coming in to speak a little bit about green building. That won't be again until December 8th, so we have a couple of weeks until that. If anyone would like to stick around, feel free to ask any more questions. You're more than welcome to. And hope you have a great homecoming weekend. Thanks.